Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. And now for something completely different. Monty Python fans recognize that one. The Middle East, Israel, Iran, terrorism, and Israel's extraordinary successes against terrorist organizations, Syria, Turkey's increasingly malign behavior, hostages, and the Biden administration response to events have consumed us for more than a year. But in that year, we've also had a nerve-wracking election, excuse me, that resulted in a change of administrations with an epic change in policy direction, which we are not going to talk about today. We are going to talk about presidents, though. Our guest is author and presidential historian and member of the JPC Board of Fellows, Tevi Troy. He has a new book about the relationship between industry, media, and presidents, beginning with Ulysses S. Grant and John D. Rockefeller and going right up to the present. The book is called The Power and the Money, The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chiefs and Titans of Industry. He's going to talk about it, but let me tell you before he talks about it. I read it. It will be reviewed in the next issue of In Focus Quarterly. It's fabulous. And he's just made us a great offer, because if we did this program in person and 30 or 40 of you were there, we would ask you to buy the book. So you can't buy the book because we're not with you. But you can buy the book. I would go online and buy the book. And Tevi's offer is, if you do that and let me know, he will sign book plates for you. So buy the book. You're going to want to buy it after he talks, but I'm telling you before he talks. Buy the book, let me know you bought the book, and we will have him do the book plates for you, and you can put them in it. It will be worth your while. So before we get to him, though, as we always do, the introduction to the Jewish Policy Center. We were founded in 1985 to provide perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policies by scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find us on our website, www.jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine, In Focus Quarterly, appropriately as the polar vortex drives up our heating bills. The winter 2025 issue is up there now. It is entitled Iran, Freedom or Fire. It is not a question. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Since October 7th, our most important job has been to support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And now more than ever, we support the government of Israel and the IDF in their defense of the people of Israel and the borders of Israel, and in bringing Hamas and Hezbollah to justice, whatever and wherever justice is, and making Hamas release the remaining hostages. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. Enough about us. Tevi Troy is, as I said, a fellow of the JPC. He's also senior fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute and a senior scholar at Yeshiva University's Strauss Center. He's a former deputy secretary of HHS and former senior White House aide. He's the author of 5 books on the presidency, including The Power and the Money, which we're going to talk about. But he is also the author of 2 of my total favorite books. One is called Shall We Wake the President, which I reviewed for In Focus in 2017. Buy it now. It's about the way different presidents handled national emergencies, both natural and man-made. But the reason I liked it is that at the end of the day, the book is not about presidents and it's not about disasters. It is about the responsibility we as citizens have to take our own care of our own well-being in a crisis. COVID and the California wildfires drive home the point. We are responsible. Can't wait for the president. But it's a great book. I also reviewed Fight House, Rivalries in the White House, from Truman to Trump in 2020, end of the first term, noting that it had an appendix called White House Nicknames, which is outrageously funny. There's a great appendix in The Power and the Money, and he can tell you about that. Tevi has a BS in Industrial Policy and Labor Relations from Cornell University and an MA and PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas in Austin. Tevi Troy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shoshana. Thank you so much to the Jewish Policy Center for doing this. And when I started my career, I saw this entity, the Jewish Policy Center, and I looked at them and I said, wow, that is the coolest collection of people on the Board of Fellows, people like Norman Podhoretz and Ruth Weiss. And I said, that's the kind of group you want to be involved with. And then when I was actually asked to be a member of the Board of Fellows, that was incredibly flattering and gratifying. And so I'm so excited and happy to be a part of this association. And I'm always happy to do events with you. And so thank you very much for having me. As Shoshana said, I've written this new book on presidents and CEOs. I wrote it before the whole Elon Musk celebration at the inauguration, Elon Musk's endorsement of Trump, Mark Zuckerberg's bending of the knee. But a lot of the themes I write about are just so relevant today. And Shoshana and I were joking before we started about the kind of predictive ability I seem to have in my books. I write these histories of the presidency, and yet I wrote about one about presidents and disasters before COVID. In fact, I even warned that we had no countermeasures for coronavirus back in 2016 when the book came out. I wrote about presidents tweeting in 2013 before Donald Trump became president based on his skillful use of Twitter. And then I've written this book about presidents and CEOs before CEOs became the complete focus of conversation. And it's been a fun week with inauguration. I've had a lot of recognition of the book. The Washington Post wrote about it this week. The Economist wrote about it. I had a great review in the Wall Street Journal. So I seem like I have good timing on my book. And Shoshana was saying, whatever I do for my next book, don't make it anything depressing or bad, because I wouldn't want to predict that. So maybe my next book will be about presidents and unicorns and rainbows or something like that. So we can have a very positive few years ahead of us. But that said, I do want to talk a little bit about my book on presidents and CEOs. People ask me why I wrote this book and at this time. And as you see with all of my books, I have this theme. The theme is presidents and blank. I'm a presidential historian, as Shoshana noted. I worked in the White House, so I have insights into the presidency from both an academic and also real-world practical perspective. And so having those two perspectives on the presidency has led me to this career where I write these books about presidents and something, and that something has to be something that no one has ever covered before, and also something that is relevant to our current moment. And so I guess I've had good luck on timing with the books, and I think this Presidents and CEOs fits my model of presidents and blank that nobody's covered, and that fits the current moment. Because what I noticed, even before the Elon Musk election, even before Zuckerberg kind of turning around to Facebook/Meta in response to the Donald Trump victory, I noticed that we are in a moment where CEOs are more and more important and more relevant, and corporations are hugely important. And also, we're in a moment where both sides seem to have their issues with corporations. Both Democrats and Republicans have been increasingly critical of corporations. The Musk-Trump friendship notwithstanding, you do see people like J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley who've been much more critical of corporations than Republicans of yesteryear. Democrats, of course, it's their bread and butter to go after corporations, and you hear Bernie Sanders talk about the millionaires and billionaires. So there's got to be a reason why they're so much the focus of attention. And part of it is because of all they bring to us, right? These machines that I'm talking to you on right now, and the cars we drive, and the fuel that powers those cars, and basically everything in our lives is touched by corporations in a way that it wasn't the case back in 1870 when I really start the narrative of the book. You didn't really have corporations at that time, and they didn't provide anything. There were no nationwide goods in the way that you had mass-produced goods of today. In addition, the federal government also had much less involvement in our day-to-day lives. The only interaction that most people had with the federal government in that period was when the post office delivered the mail. But other than that, you didn't have what we have today, which is roads are subsidized and regulated by the federal government. Cars are subsidized and regulated by the federal government. Your education is subsidized and regulated by the federal government. Food is subsidized and regulated by the federal government. So the federal government is involved in every aspect of our lives in a way that it wasn't in 1870. And the book, The Power and the Money, really talks about the development of these two things, the growth of corporations and the growth of government, and the way that they become intertwined over time. Shoshana very kindly mentioned my appendices, one of which, the one that she likes, I'm going to talk about in a moment. But there's one in there where I have a chart that graphically depicts the rise of the federal regulatory state. And it shows how the regulatory state has become more and more intertwined in what the world of business does, to the point where businesses need to take account of the federal government in just about everything they do. That doesn't mean they can't make profits. I'm not saying that we live in a socialist society where the government decides the profits, but what we do have is a heavily regulated economy where business has to not only take into account what government is saying in terms of who they hire and what products they can sell and where they can sell their products and what they can do with their environmental offshoots and what are their what are their green footprints. But it's not only they have to take the federal government into account, but just about everything they do is in some ways done in such a way as to serve social ends. So for the last 8 years or so, we've had this DEI issue. Trump, I say to his credit, is getting rid of DEI in the federal government, and it looks like some corporations are following. But if you have these DEI mandates from the federal government, then you are thinking about federal policy in all of your private hiring decisions. And so that intermixing of the federal and the private sector is a huge phenomenon, and also why I wrote the book, because that, as that appendix shows, we are now in a situation where the federal government just has so much say over what corporations do. Again, not preventing them from making revenue or profits, because they make huge amounts of revenue in the trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars, in fact, and they employ hundreds of millions of people. But these corporations also are in some ways at the sway of the federal government. And the story of the book is really the story of how the modern American economy has developed. And as I do with all my books, I do it through stories and stories of the presidency. Shoshana correctly notes that I started with Ulysses S. Grant, and he was president in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and he noticed the rise of the trusts, as he called them at the time, which were the railroads and the energy companies that John D. Rockefeller ran. And he didn't even mention them by name. He just noted that he was uncomfortable with what they were doing. But at the time, and this is important, he had no mechanism for addressing them other than rhetorically. There was no regulatory state that could address these questions. There was no Sherman antitrust law. And over time, these regulations and pieces of legislation have started to develop to the point where the corporations increasingly had to take account of them. Now, at first, some corporations were skeptical. They didn't think that the federal government mattered that much. This is the case of John D. Rockefeller, who builds the hugest oil power empire in the world. And it really happens in a 10-decade period, a 10-year period, a 1-decade period from 1870 to 1880, where he starts as a nobody, and at the end, he has 90% of refining capacity in the US, and his company, Standard Oil, is a household name. The reason they called it Standard Oil is because the oil industry was very up and down at the time, unreliable, combustible. You didn't know what product you were getting. And he was creating a standard for what the oil products you got from his company were going to be. And in a way, he was showing the benefits of private sector regulation. He was regulating his products so that you know you were getting a certain level of product. And it wasn't the federal government doing it, but it was him who did it. But anyway, he's somewhat skeptical and aloof from the federal government. He doesn't think the federal government is really relevant to him. He tells his people, for the most part, to ignore bad press because it's not really an issue. But the bad press gets worse and worse, driven in part by massive industrial press magazines that are powered by his very own creation, the oil empire. And one of those magazines, McClure's magazine, runs this series on Rockefeller and Standard Oil that by a woman named Ida Tarbell. It's very critical of him. And it just so happens to take place at a time when Teddy Roosevelt is in the White House. And Roosevelt seizes the opportunity to go after Standard Oil. Now, interestingly, Rockefeller is basically retired at this time. He's playing golf every day. But Roosevelt recognizes a political villain when he sees one and goes hard after Rockefeller rhetorically, makes him the villain, makes him the target, and creates a Bureau of Corporations to go after the corporations, including Standard Oil, and seeks to break up Standard Oil. Now, Roosevelt does not successfully break up Standard Oil during his presidency, but he sets the wheels in motion for the Supreme Court to rule on the breakup of Standard Oil, which they do during the administration of Roosevelt's hand-chosen successor, William Howard Taft. Rockefeller learns on the golf course, of course, that Standard Oil has been broken up and the Supreme Court okayed it. And he's playing golf with a priest, and he says to the priest three brilliant words of financial advice at the moment that he hears this terrible news that his baby, his company that he created has been broken up. He says, buy Standard Oil. And why does he say that? Because he recognizes that broken up, Standard Oil may be even more valuable. And he was right, because what does broken up Standard Oil become? It becomes Chevron and Exxon and Mobil and BP and all these huge companies that are incredibly profitable and have been a part of the landscape for over a century. So even in his worst moment, when his company was broken up and he was distraught about it, he recognized the financial opportunity. Now, interestingly, Rockefeller is not the only Titan to make this mistake of thinking that the federal government doesn't really apply to him and he doesn't have to worry about it. Another one is Lew Wasserman, who is a Hollywood mogul in the 40s and 50s, and he wants to go from being a top agent, in fact, he was Ronald Reagan's agent, he wants to go from being an agent to a studio head. But the rules of the time are that you can't own an agency and studio. And Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department goes after Wasserman. Now, Wasserman, as I said, had been trying to avoid politics. He didn't go to fundraisers. He didn't think politics was important. But once the federal government comes after him, he recognizes that, hey, I've got to get involved in this thing. And he goes all the way in contrast to Rockefeller. He befriends multiple presidents. First starts doing stuff for John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's assassinated. Then he becomes really close friends with Lyndon Johnson. And he does multiple fundraisers for Johnson. And one of my favorite stories in the book is about a time when he wanted to do a fundraiser for Johnson at the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles. The Coconut Grove is a legendary meeting room in LA, and it's a place where the Oscars were held in many years. But that particular night that he wanted the fundraiser for Johnson, and as you know, the president's schedule is very tight. It's not like you have a lot of choices the nights you can get the president. The night he wanted to get the Coconut Grove, it was occupied. So he calls up the Coconut Grove. He says, what is this? I need it for the president. Who is taking the Coconut Grove on the night I need it? Well, he's told, and the people on this call will appreciate it, that it is occupied by a bar mitzvah. It has been reserved for a bar mitzvah. Wasserman says, give me the name of the bar mitzvah father, which, might be some kind of, I don't know, HIPAA or privacy violation, but nonetheless, they give it to him because he's Lew Wasserman. And Wasserman calls the bar mitzvah father, and he says, I need the Coconut Grove the night of your kid's bar mitzvah. Well, the father understandably says, well, what do you need it for? I mean, we've reserved it. And Wasserman says, I need it for a fundraiser for the president of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Well, the bar mitzvah dad thinks about this for a moment. He says, okay, I'll tell you what. I will let you have the Coconut Grove if you let my son and me meet the president. Seems like a fair deal. Wasserman agrees, the father agrees, hangs up the phone. 5 minutes later, the phone rings. Wasserman picks it up, and the father is on the phone, sheepish, and says, I hate to tell you this, but the rabbi also has to meet the president. And so rabbis are as they are back then and even today. And so the rabbi gets to meet the president, and then Wasserman has his fundraiser with Johnson. But I tell you the story not just because it's fun for this particular audience, but because it indicates the level of commitment that Wasserman had to Johnson, and Johnson reciprocated. And Wasserman was in the White House for strategy sessions. Johnson had a phone installed in Wasserman's house against Wasserman's wishes, but had a phone installed in Wasserman's house so that they could be in touch. And Wasserman maintains his connections to presidents throughout the years, including the Republican Ronald Reagan, for whom he had been not only Reagan's agent, but got Reagan his first $1 million contract. And in the Reagan years, Wasserman is faced with a regulation called the FinCIN regulation, the Financial Interest and Syndication regulation. And this regulation would have negatively impacted the movie studios, of which Wasserman by this time is now head of. And so even though it's a deregulatory initiative to do this FinCIN regulation that is too complicated to explain on this call, but you're welcome to read the book and see all the details about it. So Wasserman personally intercedes with Reagan and gets Reagan to go against his free market instincts and allow the FinCIN regulation to not go forward or prevent it from going forward. So that's how Wasserman approached things. And then just to show that this is a recurring theme, you have later on Bill Gates, who builds his own empire in the software world. He also is dismissive of the federal government. He also thinks the federal government doesn't apply to him. And he even has this saying where he says, the private sector is 3 times faster than the federal government. The high-tech sector is 3 times faster than the traditional private sector. So we're 9 times faster than the federal government. Do the math, it works. But even if you're 9 times faster, the federal government is still a lot bigger. And if they grab you by the ankle, they're not letting go. And this is what Bill Gates learns to his disadvantage in the Clinton years. Clinton takes a much more activist position on antitrust than the Reagan and Bush administrations had when Gates is building his empire. And so Gates has to face this onslaught from the federal government. And the interesting thing, and I laid this out in The Power of the Money, is that at the very time that Clinton's Justice Department is going after Gates and his company, Clinton is befriending Gates. He's playing golf with him. He has him at White House policy seminars. And what I call it in the book is the compartmentalization of things, where the president and a CEO can have their own personal relations, even as a company is being assaulted by the federal government. Gates eventually leaves the company after they get a pretty hard hit from the federal government. And I argue in the book that it was as related to Gates's flawed strategy in fighting the federal government. The general counsel of Microsoft now, who is the president, is a guy named Brad Smith, and he argues that the correct approach is to make peace. And Microsoft has been much more focused on making peace with the federal government and has built a formidable lobbying shop in Washington. So Gates, in a way, learns his lesson. And then when the new wave of tech entrepreneurs come through, particularly in the form of Mark Zuckerberg, when he meets Bill Gates, who's his hero, who he modeled himself after, like Gates, he was coding at a young age, like Gates, he went to Harvard, like Gates, he dropped out to build his company. But Gates meets him and he gives him some really good advice, kind of like Rockefeller gave to the priest. He said, the advice he gives is get an office there now. And by there, he means Washington, D.C., because he doesn't want Zuckerberg to be burned in the same way that Gates had. And as we see, even in recent days, Zuckerberg is very focused on Washington, D.C., sees which way the wind is shifting, and now has befriended and got much closer to President Trump than he did in his first term. And then in the interregnum, I guess the Biden years, it was not a good period for Zuckerberg and Facebook. And Biden even said that he is not a fan of Zuckerberg and Facebook. And so that was a problem for their company. That's why he was more supportive of Trump in the election period, but certainly in the post-election period, he and his deputy, Joel Kaplan, have been not only supportive of the new administration, but also critical of the outgoing administration. So that's basically the outline of the book. I talk about all these different CEOs. There's 18 CEOs that I cover in the book, and the whole key to all of them is that they've had to have relationships with multiple presidents, also CEOs of iconic American industries, well-known household names for the most part, and tons of stories about how these CEOs have interacted with the president. Sometimes they clashed, sometimes they collaborated. And interestingly, again, for this group, of the 18 CEOs, 5 are Jewish, which is a pretty high percentage given our percentage of the population. And the stories, I think, are not only fascinating and fun, but they're also instructive. And the last point I will make before we open up to questions is that Shoshana kind of teased out this appendix of mine. I have multiple appendices in this book and in all my books. But the appendix in this book that she liked was the one about CEO jokes. These are jokes told by and about CEOs, sometimes by presidents, sometimes to presidents. And the point of it is that if you're going to tell a joke and the joke's going to be successful, it has to be about something you know about. So it used to be, you watch Johnny Carson, and the main people that he would criticize or mock in his monologue would be presidents or big time politicians and entertainers. But these days, due to the disaggregation of entertainment, due to the fact that I don't really know who all the top singers are these days. I mean, we all know Taylor Swift, but under Taylor Swift, who are big names that everybody recognizes, that every demographic is aware of. I looked at the Oscar nominations today, and I'm a big moviegoer, and I hadn't heard of half of them. So there's this disaggregation of culture where not everybody is watching the same things, not everybody's listening to the same things, but everybody knows who the CEOs are. And that's why they are good targets for jokes, because comedians know that if they tell a joke about Cardi B, I'm not going to know who she is, or why she's funny. But if you tell a joke about Zuckerberg or Musk, then everyone's going to get the joke. And so that's why that appendix in the book, which has tons of great jokes about CEOs, told all the way back to Henry Ford jokes that he told in the White House to Woodrow Wilson. That appendix is really itself worth the price of admission. But the rest of the book is great too. I urge all of you to purchase a copy. And as Shoshana said, I would happily go down to the JPC HQ one day and sign book plates for you that the JPC will then distribute to you, and that you can put in the book if you choose to purchase it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever fine books are sold. Just send the JPC some kind of indication that you have purchased the book and your address, and we'll take care of the rest. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Thank you very much for the forum.
Thank you. That's a great teaser, Tevi. I want to go in two different directions. It's hard to figure out where to start. So, as I normally do, let's start with Jews. You have a great chapter in there about Hollywood. Hollywood is not only Jews, but Hollywood in the early days had a lot of Jews. Can you talk to us about the Jews, about the Warner Brothers, about Wasserman? They had a kind of they had an interesting perspective, which was not the same as a lot of the CEOs of that time, particularly as regards the United States, as regards President Roosevelt, and a little of that may have been misplaced because Roosevelt wasn't exactly what we thought he was. But talk to us about the Warner Brothers and the stuff that they did and how they made their movies, the attitude with which
Yeah.
they made.
So Hollywood then was different than Hollywood today in many ways, but one way is that when you went to a studio movie back in those days, the studios had a personality. They also had certain actors on retainer. So, for example, Humphrey Bogart was a Warner Brothers actor. If you saw a Humphrey Bogart movie, you knew pretty certainly that it was going to be a Warner Brothers movie because they had their own actors. And now the actors jump from studio to studio. The other thing is that you could just sense there were different things that different studios would highlight. Universal was, for example, known for monster movies, but what Warner Brothers was known was for movies that were taken from the headlines. And they also particularly were friendly with Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt befriended the Warner Brothers in the 32 campaign, had them over at his inauguration, not unlike how Musk and Zuckerberg were at this inauguration. And the Warner Brothers kind of propagandized in favor of Roosevelt and Roosevelt's interests, both in the 1930s when they plugged the New Deal, and then in the 1940s when they had a whole bunch of anti-Nazi movies. Now, I'm all for anti-Nazi movies, so that's great, but it is a form of propaganda nonetheless. And so the Warner Brothers really tried to help Franklin Roosevelt by putting him on screen, by showing him in a positive light, by promoting his policy initiatives. And interestingly, even though Roosevelt, as we all know now, was in a wheelchair, and even though he was depicted many times on screen, he was never depicted on screen in a wheelchair in any Hollywood movie until Pearl Harbor, which came out in 2001. So the studio certainly did their best to make Roosevelt look as good as possible. And there was a Jewish sensibility of the Warners. Not only were in terms of being fans and close to Roosevelt, but also pushing the anti-Nazi line. Again, I'm all for anti-Nazi lines, but that's one of the things they pushed. They had a real sensibility to themselves, and it was a very beneficial collaboration that they enjoyed. Also, interestingly, as I point out in the book, it helped them to some degree, but not in every degree. So, for example, the IRS went after the Warners during the Roosevelt administration. So it didn't mean they got off scot-free from things, but it did mean that in general, they had a pretty close collaboration.
And as I remember the Warner Brother movies, they were very patriotic. So it wasn't really just about showing Roosevelt in a good light or in a positive way, but also very pro-American stuff. And
Yeah, look,
that's how I was raised.
both Democrats and Republicans were patriotic back in those days. It seems like we've unfortunately gotten away from that. And, I think it's actually one of the weaknesses of the Democrats. If you're so critical of America, you can't say, I want America to succeed. I want America to be great. Then it just makes it hard to make the sale to the American voter. And I think we saw that a little bit in this campaign. Not only did Trump win a big victory, but he really gained in just about every precinct in America. I mean, even the blue precincts in New York City, they didn't go for Trump, but they went more for Trump than they had in the previous election.
So let's look at this then. The book title doesn't say anything about the media. Okay, we're talking about corporations and presidents. And the media occupies a sort of odd spot between them because today it's hard to tell what's media and what's corporate. But I want to go back to Henry Luce and FDR and the role of Time magazine and Henry Luce. He didn't like FDR, but actually he didn't like FDR's policy. He was anti-communist, and FDR was reading Walter Duranty in the New York Times, which gave him a slightly different view.
Talk about propaganda.
Talk about propaganda. See, nothing is new. The whole world is just based on all these things that came before it. So Henry Luce and FDR had an adversarial relationship. Henry Luce was also anti-regulation. But he only actually had a circulation, Time had a circulation of 400,000. There are X posters today that have triple the circulation that Time magazine had then. Now, how influential, though, was Henry Luce with those 400,000 Time readers as compared to, what's going on today? Did FDR have to look at that and say, oh my God, there's Henry Luce? Or did he look at Luce and say, too bad for you?
No, he was aware of the criticism he got from Time magazine, and he was not a fan of it. And yeah, there were 400,000 subscribers in the early days, but by a certain point, if you looked at all the Luce magazines, the circulation got into the tens of millions because they not only had Time, but they also had Fortune and Life magazine. And Sports Illustrated wasn't politically focused, although these days ESPN sure is. But he had wider reach than just the 400,000 people who got the mailed copy in the early days. But it is true that Luce was not a fan of Roosevelt and was critical of him and tried to defeat him in multiple elections. Obviously not successful because Roosevelt was 4 for 4 when he ran as president. He ran once as vice president and was unsuccessful back in 1920. But he won all 4 elections where he was at the top of the ticket. And Luce is doing all these things to try and defeat Roosevelt, including propping up poor old Alf Landon in 1936. There's this thing that they had at times called the breakfast technique, where you would have breakfast with some kind of mover and shaker, and you would report on what they ate for breakfast and what they looked like in the morning. It was just a way to puff people up. And the breakfast he had with Alf Landon, Landon ate kidneys for breakfast. I don't know why, but the comment about him about that article, even to this day, was no one ever forgot the kidneys because it was such a distinctive thing to have for breakfast. But Landon doesn't win, and neither did the other people that Luce promotes against him. But finally, in 1952, Roosevelt's out of the picture; he's dead, and Luce goes to promote Eisenhower and is much more successful here. He provides staff for Eisenhower. He writes positive editorials about Eisenhower. He helps craft the foreign policy platform at the Republican National Convention. And he is very much like Elon Musk in some ways in being the first buddy and being very close to Roosevelt. His wife becomes ambassador to Italy. He becomes an informal advisor to the administration. So there are a lot of benefits to him, but there's also some negatives for him, in that Time becomes so in the tank for Eisenhower that it actually hurts the company and the magazine's reputation. There's even a joke that Time is even-handed. Half the time it promotes the Republicans, the other half of the time it bashes the Democrats. So Time is just seen as a Republican magazine, which is kind of ironic given that today it's a left-wing, I don't want to say rag, but it's a shadow of its former self and it's far to the left of what it was. And I think Luce would kind of spin over in his grave if he saw Time magazine today. But yeah, Luce is a very influential figure. And one of the things I do in the book, and Shoshana kind of alludes to this when she said it's about presidents and corporations and media. Many of the moguls I focus on are part of the media, whether it's the Warner Brothers or Katherine Graham at the Washington Post or Henry Luce at Time Magazine. The media is not just the way you get your information, but these are also important corporations in the American landscape.
And I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But it also should be said that presidents didn't always take this stuff lying down. Sometimes they would do things against the corporation, which was, sort of what you'd expect. But FDR, and this, I was shocked. This is in the book, and I was shocked. FDR refused a Silver Star medal to John Hersey that the military had approved because he was with Time Magazine. I mean, he had done his service in World War II, and he was deserving, said the military, of a Silver Star. And FDR didn't give it to him. And that seems to me one of those personal things. I think you see more of those today. Am I right?
You certainly have the capacity because as the regulatory states get bigger and bigger, the president has more and more mechanisms that he can use to go after certain corporations. And the corporations are acutely aware of it. I talk in the book about this problem of selective enforcement. The regulatory state is so vast and there's so many things it can do, but it can't necessarily enforce every rule against every company because there's just not enough enforcement hours in the day. But if they pick a certain company and they want to go after it, then they certainly can do that. And I cite in the book a Wall Street Journal editorial about the way in which the Biden administration went after Elon Musk's companies and all the various investigations and regulatory actions against Musk. And there's a great line in it that I quote directly in the book. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, "We doubt that there was any memo directly written by President Biden saying go after Musk, but the message of criticism made the signal very clear to regulatory officials that it would be a safe person to go after."
So it was clear that Elon Musk was going to come up in the conversation, partly because the book ends before the current election. And so Elon Musk seems to have traveled a wide distance. He was, what did you call, you called him a Democrat that the Democrats hate. And clearly there was reason for that in the Biden administration, although he supported Biden in the beginning. And then he comes around and he's not only supporting Trump, but he's one of the people now in the administration or associated with the administration. First of all, the question is, do you think that affected the election at all? Do you think there was influence by Musk, that people look at Musk and they have certain feelings about him, both negative and positive? Do you think he had an impact on the election?
Yeah, two things on that. So first of all, Musk backs Obama in 2012. He backs Hillary in 2016. He backs Biden in 2020. So, I mean, he is lifelong Democrat. And the first time he supports a Republican for president is actually 2024, when he supports Trump. So, there is a bit of a shift. But I think he was surprised at the level of hatred that he got when he talks about free speech, when he purchases X. And he's thinking, I'm a Democrat, and why are these guys going after me so hard? And I think that pushed him in the direction of becoming this anti-woke warrior and this first buddy of Trump. Now, in terms of, remind me, what was the other part of your question about Musk?
Oh, whether that was, how influential do you think he is? And I'm
Yeah,
going to ask you the same
right.
question about some other people. So part of the thinking here, part of the question is, how much influence do these people have outside of their own industries and in the American public? So Musk would be the first one of those I would ask about.
So this is interesting because it gets to the point I was making earlier about the disaggregation of culture. Yeah, Cardi B endorsed Biden, but I can't name any of her songs. I don't know if anybody on the call can name any of her songs. I mean, what does it
No.
matter that Cardi B is endorsing Biden? Who cares? But Elon Musk, everybody knows. And people were shouting at Trump rallies, Elon, Elon, Elon. He's a different type of celebrity. He's not in Hollywood movies. He doesn't have popular songs, but he's a celebrity nonetheless. And his celebrity status is something that Trump recognized was an asset to him in the campaign. So yeah, I do think Musk was helpful, and his endorsement and his showing up at the rallies was something that was beneficial to Trump.
Did that start with Oprah Winfrey? You have a good section in there about Oprah Winfrey, who had announced herself as not being political. She was not going to do politics. She was an entertainer. And that lasted until Barack Obama was running for office. And then she decided that she would change her mind. And she also endorsed Hillary Clinton. Was she the first?
Well, Oprah's interesting because first of all, she correctly, as you correctly state, she does stay out of politics for many years and is studiously against politics. And interestingly, the only presidential candidate she has on in her early years is Donald Trump in 1988, when Trump is flirting with running for president, but she really has him as this businessman and the author of Art of the Deal. And then in 2000, she has both Gore and Bush on, and both of them see bumps popularity bumps after going on Oprah. So people recognize the value of Oprah. Then in 2008, she does endorse Obama, but in some ways, she loses some political power by going so all in on Obama, because then she's just seen as another liberal Democrat. And, people who stay home and watch her show are, women who are staying at home, they're not all Democrats. So a lot of them don't like her politics to the point where in 2024, I heard this. I think it was Christine Rosen on the commentary podcast had this great line where she said every time that Oprah would get up there and go, Kamala Harris, another Trump voter was born because it was just so annoying. And so yeah, I think this is an interesting thing, and it's kind of related to the Luce point that the more these people go all in with one candidate, the more they lose their power as someone who can sway all American voters. The Republicans like them, or the Democrats like them, depending on which candidate they pick, but they don't have the ability to influence the wider electorate by by picking one candidate and going all in with them.
So is it a business proposition then? I mean, you saw Elon Musk move over, and partly that was a free speech issue, and partly that was irritation with the Biden administration. But you also had Zuckerberg. Now, Mark Zuckerberg went all in for Biden. What did they call them? Zuckerbucks, funding things
Yeah,
and
hundreds of millions of dollars for
hundreds of millions of dollars and censoring certain things and doing kinds of things that conservative people thought was simply political activity for Joe Biden. He has apparently cleared the decks with Donald Trump. He was at the inauguration. Jeff Bezos was not only at the inauguration, but even before that, he had the Washington Post not endorse. And
Right, which sent people
that's
at the Post into a complete tizzy and embarrassing hissy fit with multiple of them leaving the Post. And I say to all those people who left, good riddance. So yeah, I mean, I think they just went nuts over this lack of endorsement. And from Bezos's perspective, the Post is this enterprise that's losing him $100 million a year. I mean, he's losing serious money on the Post, and it's had this massive drop in circulation. And he's got his own space industry company. And why should he risk that company for this minor failing paper? I know it's an influential paper and has a storied history, but why should, from his perspective, from his business perspective, why should he risk his big ambitions in space for this minor paper that is filled with a lot of woke whiners, has been making a lot of political mistakes in recent years, and is actually losing him a lot of money?
so this is both a business decision, perhaps, or maybe more of a business decision for people like Bezos. And the LA Times did the same thing. They declined to endorse this year. And they're just saying to themselves, I got to be a businessman first and a political personality later in my spare time. Is that a change from what you saw as you looked at historical figures?
Yeah, and look, as these papers become more and more political, does their endorsement really sway anyone? I mean, do you think I'm really going to change my vote because the New York Times endorses someone or doesn't endorse someone? It's
No.
just not happening, and it's not just me. I mean, it's most Americans, and the Times readership is 90% liberal these days, and for the most part, their endorsements are basically fan service. They're just telling the people what they want. There's a great analysis I read of the Times is that the problem with the Times um, and this was by James Bennett, so the brother of the Democratic senator, the former head of the editorial page, the guy who got kind of pushed out as a result of the Cotton op-ed back in 2020. James Bennett says what the Times readers want is they want left-wing slant, but coming from the so-called objective New York Times. So it makes them happy to read the left-wing slant, but then they want to be able to say it's from the subjective paper. See, it's got to be true. And you can't have both. You can't be that left-wing and also be unbiased. And I think the Times has really damaged itself in recent years.
So maybe there's hope for the future of the mainstream media. Maybe they will find that it's a better business decision to be objective rather than.
I don't know if there's hope for the mainstream media. I think there's hope for the media in terms of we've got these alternative ways. Look how we're communicating right now. Look at podcasts. I mean, this was, people said this was the podcast election. A lot more people were listening to Trump on Joe Rogan. And if you listen to that interview, he sounded a lot more normal than the way he was painted in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Or you look at J.D. Vance, the way he went out and did every possible show. And, while Kamala was hiding in her hidey hole for too long, and they certainly didn't want to put Tim Walz out there because he had a story they had to clean up every time he did an interview. So I think the Democrats showed that in some ways you're weaker when you have the media on your side because you don't build up the muscles in terms of pushing back against their narratives. And so there's the old point that John Podhoretz often makes about how Republicans are multilingual and Democrats only speak one language. The only language they speak is liberal because they think that in their bubble everybody talks like that. Whereas Republicans read the New York Times and Washington Post. They see what's wrong with it, but they also read conservative newspapers. There's this great thing by Jonathan Haidt, who has been red-pilled and now is not fully a conservative, but he's recognized the problems of the left. I mean, he was interviewed in the Wall Street Journal, I don't know, about 10 years ago when Barry Weiss was still there. And he said, this is a smart guy. He grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He went to Yale. He said he never encountered a conservative idea until he was 40. How is that even possible? But that's the bubble world they live in. And I think it makes them less able to have a conversation that can appeal to people across the aisle because they can only talk to their one side.
So they are different then in some ways than the power brokers that you looked at. It seems to me because the business people, especially moguls, especially people with large productive companies, need to go profit first. Otherwise, what good are they? So is there a difference between the moguls, let's say the Rockefellers or Henry Ford? And I'm going to ask you about Henry Ford separately in a minute for something else. Is there a difference between them and the media guys in their relations with the White House? Does the White House need the media people more, or does it need the business people more?
I think we're going to see in this administration, but the great line on this comes from Michael Jordan. It says Republicans buy sneakers too, right? If you're only appealing to one group, then you will alienate people. And we saw this with Budweiser is no longer the #1 beer in America because they went all trans, and Target took a hit when they had the trans bathing suits, and people don't want this stuff in their face. They want a good product. They don't want politics from these companies. And so I think we're going to see in this administration, I mean, I'm curious to see who gets seats in the White House press room. Right? And does the AP, Washington Post, New York Times get the front row still, or are you going to have the Joe Rogan podcast, or or Breitbart, or who knows? I mean, there's all kinds of different media outlets that may have wider reach than the traditional mainstream media, and I think this administration is going to lean into that. I think.
So let's go back to history for a second. I did say I want to talk to you about Henry Ford. Henry Ford is really complicated, but in general, we had somebody send in a question that says, to what extent did U.S. manufacturers' close relations with the White House contribute to their rapid mobilization for war production capabilities during World War II? We had what was called the arsenal of democracy.
Yeah.
It didn't exist in the 30s, but boy, it sure did exist in the 40s. Is that a function of relations with the president? The presidents asked them, FDR, did he ask them and they responded? Or was it, I don't know, sort of patriotism that they jumped?
Well, in a way, it's both. I mean, they were patriotic and they jumped, and and Roosevelt was asking and pushing for it. There's a great book by Arthur Herman called Freedom's Forge that talks about the mobilization of our industrial might in World War II and how the corporations made it happen. And obviously, I read that book, and that was part of my thinking in The Power of the Money. But I do talk about Henry Ford, who's very hostile to Roosevelt, can't stand Roosevelt, tells anti-Roosevelt jokes, which you can find in the appendix of the book. But when World War II comes around, he's a patriot. He loves America, even though he's a largely anti-war figure. He's a pacifist, but he recognizes we're attacked. We've got to push back. We've got to fight for democracy. And he builds, despite his antipathy towards Franklin Roosevelt, he builds the largest weapons facility, armaments facility at Willow Run in Michigan. And Roosevelt, again, despite his antipathy towards Ford, he comes out and does a tour of it. It's so big they actually have to tour it in a car. They can't do. Anyway, Roosevelt obviously is impaired and can't walk, but it's so big that they have to take a car tour of it anyway. And of course, it's a Ford that they drive around in, and they're kind of jammed in the back seat. Eleanor and Franklin flanking Henry, a very unhappy Henry Ford in between the two of them because he can't stand either of them. And Edsel Ford, who is Ford's son, is sitting in one of the jump seats. We don't have jump seats anymore, but these little kind of benches that you could prop up to get an additional seat in the back seat. And he's facing Ford, he's facing his father Ford, flanked by the two Roosevelts. And he says he's getting the stink eye from his dad for being stuck wedged between these two Roosevelts in the back seat throughout the tour.
So they can overcome if
And you
if the
have to,
situation.
right?
Well,
I mean, do you think in
kind of.
his deep dark moments that Mark Zuckerberg really says, "I like that Donald Trump guy"? I mean, I think he probably doesn't, or at least certainly the people around him don't. Right? I mean, the staff at Facebook is famously liberal, with the exception of my good friend Joel Kaplan, who's now become the head of global public policy there. But they don't love Trump, maybe. But they recognize that they need to make an accommodation, and certainly that they weren't getting much from Biden, and Biden didn't like them at all, and made that pretty clear.
So another historical figure, Dwight Eisenhower, and you write about Eisenhower. Eisenhower warned us of something called the defense industrial complex. He was concerned about industry getting too close to the military. So most of the book is about presidents and relations between industrialists and presidents. But Eisenhower, who was a general who knew all about the military, was mostly concerned about industrialists and military people and the defense industrial base. Excuse me. How much influence did his White House have in the 50s and the building of our excuse me, the building of our defense industry in the post-war war? How much influence does a president have? It wasn't wartime. People were not saying, well, we'll go with Roosevelt because there's a war and the Germans are shooting us. Eisenhower was saying, don't do that. We don't want you. We don't want you to. How much influence does that have?
Well, at the same time, Eisenhower was very cognizant of the need to have some kind of military buildup to be prepared for the Cold War against the Soviets. If you think about the Highway Act, the fact that we now have highways crisscrossing the country is for mobilization purposes. It's so the tanks could traverse all the way from New York to California if need be. So I think that's part of it. So Eisenhower was very interested in making sure that we had the industrial capacity to be able to fight a war against the Soviets if need be. But at the same time, he was concerned about the too close relations, I would say, between the government and the military companies. And I think we see that today. I mean, there's just not enough defense contractors, and that's why it costs tens of millions of dollars to build a single fighter jet. There's this disturbing study that shows that China gets $20 worth of production, 20 times more dollars of production for every dollar that they spend versus what we spend. So it costs us 20 times as much to make the same amount of product. Now we have better scientists and more innovation, but that edge may not last forever, especially as they steal our best ideas. So we need to spend more, but we also need to spend more wisely. And sometimes smaller companies can produce things more cheaply, more efficiently. And look, this is what Israel has done. They figured out a way to build Iron Dome, for example, and other missile shields much more cheaply than the U.S. would build it. So, obviously we work together with them on it, but the Americans recognize the ability of Israel's scarce dollars to allow them to build things more efficiently.
So, which leads me to a thought. President Clinton was antitrust. A lot of these guys are antitrust, the presidents. Is that why? Is there a sense that if people get too big, if corporations get too big, first of all, they're going to want something from the government, and I'm going to have to decide as president if I'm going to give it to them or not. But also that there's inefficiency in that kind of size. And you've just said correctly so. When an airplane costs a lot of money, I mean, really a lot of money, you have to build fewer of them. But if you build fewer of them, then they cost more per copy. So is some of this from the president's an understanding that smaller can be more nimble and solve the problems faster and cheaper? That's Israel. They don't have any choice. They don't have anybody
Yeah.
that resembles Lockheed. But the point being, they get a lot of work done, particularly the R&D and the early stages of engineering with small companies, and then sell that small company or sell the technology to a larger company.
I wish the president's put more thought into this because look, I think the number one job of a president is to keep the country safe. And we have a lot of enemies out there, and I think that should be the number one focus. And I don't want the president focusing on, DEI and all this other stuff, it's cultural stuff. I want the president focusing on making sure that the nation has what it needs to defend itself against some very nefarious actors out there. So I don't think presidents put enough thought into this. I think the Pentagon is too bloated. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of employees. I think there's 800,000 employees at the Pentagon,
Wow.
which is an insane number. What do all those people do? They're not war fighters. I mean, this is separate from our military. None of these people actually, they lift pencils. They don't lift guns. And I think there's just too many of them, and they weigh us down. They cost too much to produce whatever it is we are producing, and we need to rethink that.
So then Eisenhower was right. Perhaps the military industrial complex is not good for the defense of the country. Not that we don't want
I would
defense
say
companies,
yes,
we do, but
but he was warning about the corporate side. I'm warning about the government side. I mean, 800,000, these are career federal employees. We have to pay their salaries, we have to pay their health care, we have to pay their retirements. And I'm sure many of them are patriotic and doing good work, but there's got to be efficiencies there. Maybe Doge can look into that. 800,000 is too many people to, what are they doing? They're doing requisition forms and making sure that Lockheed, does every jot and tittle of every regulation when they produce fighter jets and other stuff. So I just don't think that it's not quite each of those 730,000 or something like that. But I don't think those people are necessarily serving the interests of creating the best and most efficient military that we can at every minute.
so we're coming to the end of the program. And as people know, I like to go out on an optimistic note. I like the guests to say something positive. I'm going to promote your book again in a second. So that's not the positive thing. But given the relations between business and government and media and all of those things that come together in so many different ways, how do you see us doing in the next 4 years? And that's not a political question. I'm not asking about President Trump. I'm asking about us as a country. We the people, pay the price for whatever they do wrong, and we get the benefits from whatever they do right. Do you see a commonality of interest between media, business, and politicians that will work for us, or do you think we're in trouble?
I think we're on the cusp of some tremendous technological improvements in the years ahead in the field of biotechnology, in the field of artificial intelligence, in the field of energy, and in the field of transportation. I mean, look, when you fly to Europe, it's no faster today than it was 50 years ago. There have to be technological improvements that can get us to places faster. And part of it is hyper-regulation, which led to the death of the Concorde. Maybe some people on the call don't even remember the supersonic jet
Yep.
that got you across the ocean much faster than we can today. So regulations are an impediment to technological advancement. And I think if you have an administration that recognizes the impediment and also recognizes the benefit of innovation, I think we could be potentially on the cusp of a huge step forward technologically in a bunch of areas. And I'm really excited about it.
That's a good positive note. And I'm going to have you come back at the end of the Trump administration, if not before, so that we can talk about how it moved in the 4 years. But as we close the program, I'd like to remind everybody the book is called The Power and the Money: The Epic Clashes Between Commanders in Chief and Titans of Industry. It is a great book. It is the book that you want to sit down with a cup of coffee and read when the polar vortex says, it's 2 degrees. You want to read this book because you'll learn a lot and because you'll enjoy it. And as with Tevi's other books, learning through enjoyment is probably the best way to go. That is the most optimistic thing I can say at the end of a program. Do it. You'll have a good time. Tevi Troy, thank you very much for being with us, and I look forward to having you again.
Thank you, and thank JPC. I appreciate it.